Hey everybody, JMac here in another BaseCode video where I demonstrate some of the practices in the upcoming BaseCode Field Guide. All of these practices are centered around improving code readability. Writing code that's readable by other humans is the only way to write lasting code. Today I want to take a look at some code that was submitted by Frake. This is from his Oh Dear SaaS product, which basically allows you to monitor uptime as well as some other things like your SSL certificate and so forth. It's a pretty cool service, and he actually shared some of his code on Twitter the other week, and it gave me an opportunity to kind of see some code that actually is a really great foundation. In fact, it's already kind of applying most of the practices we've talked about in some of the previous videos. There's always improvement that can be made, and so we'll take a look at some simple tweaks that we can do. But since we have such a good foundation, this is a great opportunity and code sample for me to start talking about some of the, I guess, I don't want to use the word extreme, but some of the higher order practices that I'll share in BaseCode. So things like formatting and naming are really kind of on the lower end of the spectrum. They're really easy practices that you can implement kind of right away, immediately. You can immediately format your code. You can immediately start, expanding on your naming conventions, not using abbreviations, trying to write things that are more human readable. So again, we see that this does a really good job of kind of already practicing those things. If I do the old standard Command Option L in PHP Storm, I don't get any formatting that really changes. We see some nice readable names here, so needs to run, has active subscription. All of these things are very human readable, right? So this is a great foundation, and I think there's just some minor tweaks that we can do that I'll start with. But like I said, what I want to get into are kind of more of the advanced practices. And this practice particularly that I want to focus on for this code is actually symmetry. So let me just put that here to remind us all. So this will be the practice of symmetry that I really want to take a look at in this code. Is this code symmetrical? And symmetry is very difficult because it's one of those things that kind of takes time and experience to hone your craft, if you will. It's definitely a little bit more on what people consider the art of programming, right? Because it's subjective. It's something that'll vary project to project, team to team. What one project seems to have symmetrical, maybe another project doesn't really follow that same type of symmetry. Just like the symmetry of a circle is not necessarily the same as the symmetry of a square. So it's going to change. It's a little bit of a moving target, but I'll try my best to kind of demonstrate it and, of course, talk more about it in the field guide. Before we get into symmetry, though, let's take just the standard first pass here. So I just want to kind of go through and make sure we're kind of following, again, some of those really early practices that we've been talking about. So again, the naming looks pretty good. Everything seems to be pretty human readable. We're not worried necessarily about these verbose names because they're adding a lot of context. They're really helping kind of make the code more readable. So everything here, the nested code, I don't see any, nested code. There are obviously conditionals here, but there's nothing that goes, multiple levels deep. So that's really nice. Big blocks, we're fine here. I don't see, a large amount of code. This is only about 20 lines, including the white space. It seems to be very focused on, these checks to need to run. So I think that's pretty good. There's arguably some small things we could do here. So let's just take the opportunity to talk about those for a second. What I see are a lot of Boolean methods that are being run here. And needs to run is great. This latest run is great. This previous run has crashed is great. But what I see people do initially when they're improving their names, and again, these names are a great foundation, but what I see a lot, especially for Boolean methods, are people kind of always prefixing things with is active or has active subscription, some variation of the verb is, or I guess the word is. So some kind of bit of that is always injected somewhere in the code, and when you start getting past tense, especially like has already been run, we're starting to get, even though it's readable, we're starting to really kind of inject some extra words, in my opinion. So let's just take a look and see if there's a way to cut out has and feel like if these are still nice and human readable, but maybe the context helps just a little bit. So the first thing I think that's the pretty easy one to start with is basically this previous run has crashed. We don't really lose much by dropping the has there. Previous run crashed, right? I think that's just as readable. We already have kind of moved away from the prefix being is or has, and it still flows just as nice, right? So previous run crashed is simple enough. This check already has been scheduled or is running. So again, if we drop the has here and even the bin just for kind of extra, injections of past tense there, we can just say check already scheduled or is running, right? Check's really just another, again, kind of that Boolean kind of question, is, has, check, did. These are all things that we can prefix, these methods with to kind of denote that they're Boolean. But again, is that adding to the context? If we just said already scheduled or is running, is that okay? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You can make the decision. But the point here is that, we definitely like these human readable and verbose method names, but, we don't want to take it so far that we're just kind of adding these extra fluff words where it's almost a complete sentence or even a run-on sentence for that matter. So let's just keep applying this on a few more. So has ended more than, again, maybe we can just drop the ended. We can go with, or sorry, drop the has and just say, latest run ended more than minutes ago, right? So I think this is a little bit better. Again, this may vary from project to project, but we kind of already set the precedent that not everything had has in front of it. We already kind of had this previous bit. We have this latest run. So just a way to tighten it up, right? So this isn't just naming, this is starting to get into symmetry. We want to make sure that relative to the other method names, the method names and kind of the structure of the code, the flow of the code is all kind of following suit for this method. Within here, we want to make sure that we're trying to maintain symmetry. Definitely within this context, but also within the broader context of the application. So this isn't just necessarily consistency. Again, there's multiple levels to it. So the first level is kind of naming. So I think that's a nice opportunity there. We could go a little farther again. We could, if this has failed, this might read a little better. Maybe if we just did something more, change this to last run instead of latest run. I doubt there's probably a difference in the domain between the two. One might read better than the other depending on the team. Again, maybe the team uses latest a lot in this application, but from what I'm looking at here, I think last run can work pretty well, and it allows us to do something a little more fluid. So last run failed. So again, just flows, just tightens it up a little bit better, just sticking with those nice human readable names, but also doing something where we don't necessarily have these filler words in there. It's still pretty succinct. Okay. So I think we'll leave naming alone for now. Let's move on to kind of the structure of the code. And again, kind of with that overtone of symmetry happening. So what's interesting, again, symmetrical, we talked about in maybe the flow, right? So we kind of, let's just keep track of this. So we kind of had naming. So that's, naming. So that's good. Let's also talk a little bit about the flow. So symmetry and the flow. What I'm talking about here is we've talked about these guard clauses. But what's a little interesting is that this one returns false, and then we have a true, we have a couple more trues, this one returns false. It would be nice if kind of all of the false were up top, right? Just, again, just symmetrical in the flow. I don't have this kind of zigzag of return types happening. I don't jump from false to true to false to true. Just as a reader, it'd be nice for me to know that these are all kind of like the false conditions. So I'm just going to move this up. I highly doubt it changes the way the code behaves to have that be returned up here. Unless these methods have side effects, which would be bad in and of itself, there really shouldn't be a problem moving these around. So just a really small change there, but just bringing this up so all the falses are kind of nice and in line and the flow happens there as well. The other thing about kind of the flow that we could also talk about is the structure. They're a little bit different. And the structure of the code is kind of, we're talking a little bit here about maybe the way it's implemented, right? So flow is kind of like the logical path, right? But structure is a little bit more about the way in which we've implemented the code. So this is more about the implementation. And what I want to focus on here is that a lot of these are method calls, but some of them aren't. So this isn't a method call. This is kind of an inline, not this enabled. So we're checking a property directly, and then we're also negating it. It's not necessarily complex. Everyone, I think most developers would be comfortable with this code, understanding that code. But again, in relation to the code that's around it, its structure is different. I'm kind of having to read at a high level these methods and be able to infer from the good naming of what they do to suddenly jumping down and thinking about properties and then negating them. I also have to here kind of have this complex conditional, which is a little bit interesting. I have this optional call, which is an excellent helper in Laravel to kind of handle null objects. It basically wraps this object as a null object. That way, if you call other things below it, but this happens to evaluate to null, this whole thing evaluates to null. Whereas if you just wrote this last run arrow failed and last run returned null, you would get a PHP exception, right? The language would kind of choke there because you wouldn't be able to do that on null. But by wrapping it with this optional, anything that gets chained immediately after it is just going to be handled kind of gracefully. So it's a pretty cool little helper, but this complexity here actually breeds the complexity here. And again, we're talking about minor complexity relative to the code, not necessarily overall complexity. But this is where, again, we want to practice that symmetry. Most things in here are nice and readable, right? But we just have a few that are slightly more complex. Again, this one's great. So let's see if we can kind of clean these up just a little bit, right? So first of all, I personally don't like where I have to negate something. It's just one extra step for me. And if we're already going to be changing the way this works anyways, it'd be nice simply to just kind of De Morgan's this and basically flip the logic to where we can say something like is disabled, right? So instead of checking that it's not enabled, we're already going to add this method name for symmetry. Let's just go ahead and make it the thing that we're actually checking for, and that way we don't have to think about negations in our head, right? So, great. If the check's disabled, just return false, no problem. If it's already running, already scheduled or is running, great, return false, that feels good. Okay, before we jump to this, again, we remember that we're checking for null here. So if I actually pull this up, which is the null check, and ran this first, I would be guaranteed that if the code execution reached this level, that I don't have a situation where the last run's null, right? So that would mean that even though this optional thing's very helpful, it's unnecessary if I simply just move the code around, and now I've removed just that extra little bit of complexity. Maybe another developer's not familiar with optional, and while we don't want to deprive them from the learning experience, if it's unnecessary, we don't necessarily want to send them down the wrong path, right? So again, if we just move this up, which is a much simpler check, we can immediately run this, and we don't have to worry about it being null, right? Because we've already kind of passed that condition. So let's see, what can we do with this? This is kind of the last complex, if you will, statement. Well, before I jump into that, we can actually see that we're doing a lot of this type checking down here as well. We actually do this same check down here, as well as multiple more. So let's talk about that. Let's actually jump just a little bit ahead, because I think we're getting the idea for symmetry up here. So really what this falls under to me is something, it's a code smell actually called feature envy. This isn't necessarily feature envy directly, but kind of the other, I guess, signs of feature envy are things like message chaining. So if there's a really long message chain, so actually this is a relatively long message chain. We're actually going down to the site, and then we're going from site to team, and then calling something on team. So in general, there's nothing necessarily wrong with message chaining, but there is a little bit of coupling that happens as a side effect of that chaining, right? We actually have to know that site has team and then team has this. Sites are direct dependent, right? It's a direct dependency of check. It's one of its properties. So going kind of one level down, maybe not so bad, but going 2, 3, 4 levels down, we start to really risk some high coupling between those things. The other thing that's on it is kind of the other kind of subcomponent of feature envy is actually inappropriate. Let's see if I can spell this right. Inappropriate intimacy. So, oh great, good. Okay, so yeah, inappropriate intimacy. And this is really what we're talking about here. Type, again, is a property of check, but this code seems to be much more interested in what's happening in check type. And while we have these constants, and again, that's a very common thing for developers to kind of leverage constants and compare them in other classes, maybe there's a way that we could clean this up just a little bit to make it potentially more readable. Because everything within this method is actually far more interested in doing checks that relate to the check type than they do the check themselves, right? So let me kind of make an example by recreating this line in maybe a different way, right? So instead of kind of reaching directly into check type and comparing against one of these constants, which is a common practice, maybe we can kind of invert that just a little bit and push all of what happens in check type down to that directly. So we could say something like check type. For now, let's just say that this is a static method because there's really no state that's happening here. We could say is mixed content, right? And we would just pass that type down there. So if it is, then we would do the return, 60 times 12. So same logic here, but instead of this, again, kind of low-level check that's happening, we get a little bit more of a readable check. You could always do this. You could also do this with something like polymorphism. So maybe there was a way to create a very particular check type. So we could do something like this check type. Let's say it was an object, and then we could say, is mixed content, right? So maybe this is just a nice little factory method that determines type and sets up some kind of object where we can talk to it directly. At that point, you could even go farther and push down the minutes between the run if you wanted to. So minutes between run. And we could actually start to abstract everything down there. We've talked about this before in the big blocks video, but the point here is that basically this logic is far more interested in what's happening in check type than it is what's happening in the check model. So instead of this class and kind of having this really dummy, enum type class here, we could actually abstract pretty much this entire original method off to that class. So we could just take this out of here, kind of move it to a little bit more of where it seems to be concerned of doing things, and just simply pass in its type, right? So we could change this to just type, and we would basically pass in the type. So, and whatever data type that was, they do seem to be using type hints here. So I believe, that's either an int or a string. I think in the real world it's a string is what he said. But basically, yeah, this would be a way to kind of push all that down to a more appropriate home. These checks are now isolated right here within this class. They're not really getting shared and kind of littered throughout the code, right? And we would simply change this to that static method. So check type minutes between runs. Whoops. This is a public static function now. So that should clean up just a little bit. And we pass in this type. I think that type hint's probably making it mad, but there we go. So great. So now again, if we were to make those helper methods, we could actually get rid of this and kind of use that check type is uptime or is check uptime to tinker into here if we wanted to. So we could do check type, check type is uptime check, and we would pass in, this type. And again, if we wanted to make those helper functions. But the point here is that nice symmetry. Now everything in here is effectively a method call of some kind, or a chained method call. And again, as far as this, we'll talk about this probably more in future videos. I may even consider adding this as an additional practice as far as what happens. Right now there's 10 practices. I really want to map almost every kind of style or practice of programming you can think of back to one of these core 10. But feature envy is kind of one of those areas that maybe isn't covered or not covered enough. So again, it might be something I talk about a little bit more in a future video. So for now, though, basically, this is probably where I would slow down. Again, I think at best I would pull that out where I'm not going multiple dependencies down, so I don't increase the coupling too much. I would actually, decrease it if I were able to just move that subscription off. But that would probably be as far as I would take this on first pass. I would wait to break out any more abstractions or create any new classes or maybe move this code up to some kind of service object until I was at a point where the functionality was growing. But for now, real simple kind of first pass as far as some of the practices we've learned. It's always best to make sure things are formatted, give the naming just one more thing. If you go through and kind of ask yourself questions, well, like what's the difference between latest run and last run? Maybe we can tweak that name just a bit. Naming is always one of those things that's kind of just a constant improvement. But symmetry is really what we were after today. So symmetry is through all of the code. There's multiple layers of symmetry. It's really something that you want to challenge yourself on and kind of practice in all of the code that you write. But in this case, we just wanted to touch it up for symmetry and naming. Symmetry in the flow, all of those false statements are kind of up top, all of the true statements, and then kind of the beef of the run in the majority of the case would be kind of our final primary action. We want to check also the structure, right? Before we were checking properties, we kind of had some complexity in other, function calls and so forth. We had some stuff that was just a straight check and then some things that were negated. We had some kind of more complex statements that were happening, but now everything's a nice simple method call. And it gives us just an increase, a future reader to kind of just, again, get used to the code, right? It starts to feel natural. Everything is just kind of almost the same, right? It's very symmetrical. So that's it for today. I'll share this on GitHub, and I also think, I think Frake is actually going to share, take some of these practices and actually share what he considered to be his final code. So again, I might have taken some liberties here with latest run. Maybe that makes sense. Maybe I don't understand their domain as much, so maybe latest run makes a little more sense in their code base than last run. So we'll see what he ends up with, and I'll probably share a link to that. So if you haven't subscribed already, again, make sure to jump out and subscribe to BaseCode. I hope to be sending some sample chapters here in the next week or two, and then the early edition with the first 5 practices with code samples, hopefully by the end of the month. I know I said that before, but I am making myself hit this deadline, so I'm very, very close. But I love seeing more subscribers come in. It definitely gets me pumped up and gives me that extra motivation to kind of get this thing out the door. So hope you all enjoyed.